It is commonly taught in school that the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, a notion that, as we saw in previous videos, does not make a lot of sense. The Eastern Roman Empire was still very vital after 476 AD, and in this video we are going to explore the events that unfolded some 60 years after the fall of the Western Empire, when a new ambitious emperor rose to power who wanted to restore the glory of Rome and take back the lost Western provinces from the barbarians with the help of one of the greatest generals in the history of mankind. Thus, the time had come for the Roman Empire to strike back. When the Western Roman Emperor Romulus Augustus was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer on September 4th, 476 AD, we have learned in previous videos that not much actually changed. In the city of Rome itself, it must have been a barely noticeable event, since the emperors after Maiorianus and Anthemius did not hold real power anymore. Barbarian generals now wielded the power in the West. An envoy of the Senate of Rome brought the Western imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring that an emperor was no longer needed in the West. Odoacer would now be the Patricius of Rome and would be the representative of the Eastern Roman Emperor in the West. So from the perspective of the Eastern Roman Empire, all that had happened was that Italy had now become a province of the Eastern Roman Empire, and that the empire had been reunified with the imperial power now sitting in Constantinople. Even coins continued to be minted in Italy, bearing the countenance of the Eastern Roman Emperor. But after some years, it became increasingly clear to the reigning emperor of that time, Zeno, that Odoacer was reigning Italy in fact as a king, acting more and more independently from the imperial authority in the East. In 480 AD, the last rightful Western Roman Emperor Julius Nepos had died, possibly assassinated by Odoacer as some thought, and Odoacer swiftly annexed the realm of Nepos in Dalmatia and incorporated this remnant of the Western Roman Empire into his kingdom that same year. Discontent with Odoacer's growing power, Emperor Zeno thus made the Ostrogoths foederati to the empire and tasked them under their king Theodoric to retake Italy from Odoacer. And Theodoric would be the emperor's representative in the province of Italia. In 488 then, the Ostrogoths moved to Italy, arrived there in 489, and after years of heavy fighting, defeated Odoacer at Ravenna in 493 AD. Thus was the Ostrogothic kingdom of Theodoric established in that same year on the former territory of Odoacer's kingdom. This was the state of the Mediterranean for some decades, and under the kingdom of Theodoric, the city of Rome enjoyed peace for 60 years. The Roman institutions continued to exist. The Roman Senate still met in the Curia, the old Senate building. Many buildings in Rome were kept in repair or even restored, and thus we can say that it was a prosperous time for Rome after the 3 sackings it had to endure in the 5th century AD under the too often incapable Western Roman emperors. And please like this video and subscribe, and also turn on the bell so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And you can now even support our work on Patreon or via becoming a YouTube member. And of course, you will also get many perks in return, such as for example suggesting video topics or participating in exclusive live streams. Thanks to support from amazing people like you, we will be able to explore many different topics of the late Roman Empire for years to come. Gratias a tutti, amici. But in the east, a new emperor had risen to power, and his name was Petrus Sabatius, better known as Justinian. And this emperor had an ambitious plan, nothing less than to restore the full extent of the former Roman Empire and to win back the lost provinces of the Roman Empire in the west. And the first province with which this reconquest would begin was the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. This once Roman province had been under Vandal rule for 100 years now, and 2 attempts to reclaim this lost province had failed, once in 460 under the heroic emperor Maiorianus, and another attempt had failed in 468 in a joint effort of the respective Eastern and Western Roman emperors Leo and Anthemius. Hilderic, the grandson of the legendary Vandal king Gaiseric, and also grandson of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III, had reigned the Vandal kingdom from 523 onwards, and probably because of his partly Roman heritage, he pursued a much more pro-Roman policy than his predecessors. The Vandals themselves were Arian Christians, and Chalcedonian Christians had often been persecuted in the Vandal kingdom, but these persecutions were now ended on orders of Hilderic. However, these pro-Roman policies were highly disliked by other high-ranking Vandals, and it so came to pass that Gelimer, a cousin of Hilderic, staged a coup, overthrew the king, and had him imprisoned in 530. Upon becoming the new Vandal king, Gelimer immediately returned to anti-Roman policies and also allowed the persecution of Chalcedonian Christians to resume. This was exactly the pretext that Justinian had needed in order to justify attacking the Vandals. Many at court counseled the emperor against this, still having the failure of the Roman fleet in 468 at Cape Bon in mind, but the emperor was set on restoring the full extent of the Roman Empire. And he had the ultimate weapon that would enable this ambitious plan in form of his very able general Flavius Belisarius, Magister Militum of the Eastern Roman military forces. This general had distinguished himself at the Battle of Dara in 530, winning an impressive victory against a twice larger Persian army. Further, Belisarius had proven to be absolutely loyal to the emperor, quelling the Nika riots in 532 AD in Constantinople, thus effectively saving Justinian's rule. Justinian and Belisarius are often called last of the Romans, since they were both native Latin speakers and possessed a martial vigor and grand ambitions that would have made even Caesar or Trajan proud. Already by the early 7th century, the official language of the empire would become Greek instead of Latin. But it was exactly that quality, besides being a military genius, that made Belisarius the perfect choice to lead the expedition against the Vandals, namely being a Latin speaker. We should not forget that the population of the Vandal kingdom, even after 100 years of Vandal rule, was still Roman and spoke Latin. Thus Belisarius, Justinian thought, would win the approval of the native Romans more easily. It was thus in June of the year 533 AD that Belisarius departed from the capital of the Roman Empire, Constantinople, with 92 warships, so-called dromons, and 500 transport ships. His army consisted of 10,000 infantry, consisting partly of comitatenses from the field army and partly of foederati troops. In addition, he brought 5,000 cavalry units with him, then about 1,500 to 2,000 of Belisarius's elite guard, the Bucellarii, then 600 Hunnic horseback riders and 400 herules, giving us a total army strength of around 17 to 18,000 troops. Very able and loyal commanders such as John the Armenian and the eunuch Solomon, accompanied this military expedition, acting as chiefs of staff to Belisarius. The historian Procopius of Caesarea also accompanied Belisarius on this dangerous journey, and he left us with the most important historic source of this war, namely his work The Vandal War, De Bello Vandalico. Belisarius had the fleet make a stop in Sicily in order to acquire new provisions and to gain intelligence on Vandal activities. In that time, the relations between the Ostrogothic kingdom and the Romans were still good, such as to allow the Roman fleet to anchor in Sicily. Belisarius was very pleased indeed to hear that Gelimer had sent his brother Zazo to Sardinia with a numerable Vandal force in order to quell a rebellion, and that Gelimer was completely unaware of the Roman expedition. Upon hearing this, Belisarius immediately had the fleet set sail towards Africa. It was thus in early September 533 that the Eastern Romans landed at Caput Vada, a cape immediately to the east of an identically named city about 162 Roman miles or 240 kilometers south of Carthage. Many of his officers had advised Belisarius to sail directly on Carthage and to attempt to take the capital directly. But Belisarius was mindful of the disaster at Cape Bon in 468, when the Roman fleet was almost entirely destroyed by Vandal fireships. He therefore decided against this, and the army disembarked at the Cape at night. The city of Caput Vada immediately surrendered and was taken without a fight, as Belisarius had come to present himself as a liberator towards the Roman population from the Vandal oppressors. He ordered the army not to harm the native Romans in any way, punishing any wrongdoing with severe penalties. This would prove to work very well, and as the Roman army would now start its march northwards along the old Roman road to Carthage, the Roman cities would change sides one by one from the Vandals to the Romans. Procopius of Caesarea tells us here, the soldiers behaved with moderation, and they neither began any unjust brawls nor did anything out of the way, and Belisarius, by displaying great gentleness and kindness, won the Libyans to his side so completely that thereafter he made the journey as if in his own land. It is fascinating to read that the Romans encountered no resistance whatsoever. While marching north towards Carthage, the fleet followed the army, sailing beside the army along the coast. Gelimer, upon learning of the Romans' arrival, immediately had Hilderic and his relatives executed. He further planned to encircle the Romans at Ad Decimum, meaning at the 10th milestone, 10 Roman miles south of Carthage. His brother Amatas was to set out from Carthage and block the Roman advance, while his nephew Gibamund was to attack their flank, and Gelimer himself would attack from the rear and completely destroy the Roman army. It was thus on September 13th that the Roman and Vandal forces would fight against each other for the first time in almost 100 years. The Vandal forces were said to have been a bit smaller than the Romans, from around 14 to 16,000 men. It was now that the 600 Hunnic horseback riders scouted ahead to the west, and the vanguard under John the Armenian towards the northwest. The Huns met Gibamund's 2,000 soldiers, and upon seeing the fearsome Hunnic riders, their morale was greatly weakened. As a consequence, Gibamund's forces were utterly routed, and Gibamund himself killed. Meanwhile, Amatus had set out from Carthage, approaching with about 6,000 to 7,000 troops, but he scouted ahead too far and met John's much larger force, a mistake that would cost him his life. The rest of Amatus's forces were stretched out thinly along the road, and they quickly fled upon learning of Amatus's death. Now a Roman contingent under Solomon had reached the scene, but Gelimer's force of around 5,000 to 6,000 troops had already advanced from the south. Being overwhelmed by this much larger force, Solomon had to retreat, regrouping on the way with some 800 Roman troops and joining Belisarius' main army. Belisarius, now getting reports of what had transpired, knew that he outnumbered Gelimer's forces and quickly proceeded to engage him. Meanwhile, Gelimer had set up camp on a hill and planned to fortify his position and gather intelligence as to what had happened. But Belisarius advanced from an unexpected direction, taking Gelimer and his Vandals completely by surprise. The surprised Vandals were therefore completely routed by the Romans. Gelimer himself and the remainder of his forces then fled towards the northwest. Having freed up the road to Carthage, John awaited Belisarius. Carthage then was easily taken with no resistance, and the still mostly Roman population welcomed Belisarius as they were very impressed by the restraint that the Roman army had shown. Now the fleet had also sailed around Cape Bon and reached Carthage. Belisarius himself took up residence in the royal palace and prepared to have the city walls restored, which by this time had already been in a very bad shape. But the war was not over yet, even though the eastern part of the Vandal kingdom had fallen into Roman hands again. Gelimer was still alive, and a large part of his Vandal forces had survived the Battle of Ad Decimum. Gelimer meanwhile had sent messengers to his brother Zason, who by now had managed to quell the rebellion in Sardinia, and he returned to join forces with Gelimer. Upon hearing of this, Belisarius decided to meet Gelimer and Zason in open battle and set out westward from Carthage, where the two armies would meet at Tricamarum, 28 kilometers west of Carthage, in mid-December 533. But this time the Vandals outnumbered the Romans. However, due to the valor of John the Armenian and his cavalry units relentlessly harassing the Vandal center, the Romans managed to kill Zason. Demoralized by the loss of Zason, the Vandal army quickly collapsed, and Gelimer once again fled westward, far into Numidia. It must be noted here that Belisarius had tremendous difficulty in keeping his troops together, and had the Vandals mounted a counter-offensive, it is quite possible that the Romans would have been utterly destroyed. Procopius himself expressed amazement at the issue of the war, and did not hesitate to regard it not as a feat of superior strategy, but as a paradox of fortune. Indeed, military genius is sometimes not enough to win a war, and luck certainly also did favor the Romans. But it is still astounding that Belisarius had managed to conquer an entire kingdom with an army measuring only 17 or 18,000 men. Gelimer was captured a few months later in March 534, surrendering after having been besieged by the Romans in a mountain stronghold in Numidia. Thus was Africa again in the hands of the Romans after 100 years. Belisarius then set sail for Constantinople, accompanied by Gelimer, a large number of captured Vandals, and many treasures that had been looted by the Vandals almost 80 years earlier in the famous sack of Rome, including the imperial regalia of Valentinian III and spoils from the Temple of Jerusalem that had been captured by the Emperor Titus in 70 AD. Belisarius entered Constantinople a hero and was awarded the first ever Roman triumph in this new Rome, Nova Roma as the city also was sometimes called, in 534 AD. It was also the first Roman triumph granted to a private citizen in over 550 years. the triumph processed through the magnificent Forum of Constantine. Then it would enter the Mese, the main road of Constantinople, where Belisarius would be carried like a second Trajan on a chariot along this splendorous road. Then the triumphal procession would arrive at the Hippodrome. It was here that Gelimer, upon seeing the Emperor Justinian on his lofty throne, cried out words from the Old Testament, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." Gelimer was stripped of his kingly purple garment and sent to live in Galatia on an estate. He was treated surprisingly well and would even have been raised to the rank of Patricius had he not refused to renounce his Arian faith. Thus was an important victory won against all odds. A lost province of the former Roman Empire had been restored, but the war to fully restore the Roman Empire to its former extent had just begun, and Justinian had already set his sights on the next target, the kingdom of the Ostrogoths, Italy, the old cradle of the Roman Empire, and the city of Rome itself, the old Rome, from where the whole Roman Empire had started. And if you are interested in learning how the Roman borders collapsed in the 5th century AD, you can watch this video here in the upper right corner. But if you are more interested in what happened to Rome after 476 AD, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks to all friends of Roman history and to all who are like me absolutely obsessed with the late Roman Empire. Gratias amici imperi Romani, and bene vale.